Okay, we're back and we're going to cover the final chapter. It's called the Epilogue. A lot of classes leave this out because people don't really like to talk about this topic, but I'm trying to buck the American system and go ahead and include this chapter in our discussion. I think it's an important part of life, and that's the thing that is really important to take away from this chapter. Now, the term THANATOLOGY refers to the study of death and dying. And one of the things that THANATOLOGY really emphasizes is that there's actually hope that comes through the process of death and dying. So when we study death and we study the process of dying, there are some topics that thanatologists study. The social and emotional aspects are, of course, on the top of the list. The things that the person who maybe has forewarning that they're approaching death goes through. And then also the things that their loved ones go through as they realize the loss and process that. Thanatology has revealed that there is hope in the process of death, that there is loss, of course, and that it's an indicator that life goes on and other kinds of things. Thanatology helps us to accept dying as part of the process of living. None of us really like to think about our own mortality. We'd rather think about it as a more abstract thing. But when we realize that death is part of living, then it kind of can give people, more hope in their lives. It can reaffirm their life, make them feel more alive as they realize that, I am mortal and I have a limited amount of time. So let's switch over to talking about how people cope with death at different stages of development. So for example, how do children cope with the death of a loved one? I mean, and a loved one for a child could range from, a goldfish to a parent. And for children, there isn't necessarily a lot of difference in how they cope. A lot of times we talk in terms of how is the child going to get over it. They're never really going to get over it. It's just, they don't really dwell on it because when you're a child, however you grow up just sort of is how it is. This is how life is. Kids don't think to themselves as they're growing up, if only my parent was here. Children don't think about that. If the child is young enough when they lose their parent, this is just reality. They don't remember what it was like before and things like that. So it can be really important for the people who are surrounding children to give them explanations that are helpful rather than harmful. Like, for example, saying, grandma went to sleep, or something, the dog was put to sleep. Those kinds of phrases. Kids can oftentimes take very literally, and they can become afraid to go to sleep because they're afraid that they may not wake up. So it's super important when parents talk to children about the loss of someone or something that they're really specific about what it means. When children are in the process of facing death, when they find out that their parent is ill or grandma or grandpa is ill or something like that, one of the biggest fears that children express is a fear that they're going to be alone, that no one's going to take care of them. And so things that are really important for younger children is for them to, if there's the opportunity for them to get to know whoever's going to be taking care of them, know what the plan is, know that they're going to be loved and taken care of. It's much more important for little kids to have hugs and support and routine and things like that. Trying to have logic with little kids, well, I think we talked about this earlier in class. I mean, it's just really not that helpful to try and be logical with little kids anyway, because they're not the world's most logical. So dealing with children's emotions as they emerge, just for what they are, that these are just emotions, and not try and make it all better immediately. You can't make it all better. So just let the child sort of feel what they're feeling and be supportive and be there. As kids get a little bit older, a lot of times they want to know exactly what's going on. I want to know exactly what's going to happen after my fish dies. Where is he going to go? Things like that. With parents who are ill or something, they're oftentimes wanting to know exactly what's wrong, exactly how it's been treated. They want to know these facts. As kids age from, early childhood into middle childhood, they become less anxious about death and dying. And we talked about this before when we talked about middle childhood, because this is the fact that they start to be less afraid that they might die is what allows them to sort of start spreading their wings and walking to school or spending the night at a friend's house or things like that. So losing some of that anxiety is really helpful for them to be able to sort of explore the world. And so it doesn't mean that they're going to be blasé if a death occurs. It just means that it's not the top of their mind. I thought this was a really interesting study that was conducted in 2004, where they told a story about a mouse, and in the story the mouse dies. And then they asked children afterwards a bunch of questions. And you see that the green bar is the children who were age 5, average age was 5. In the orange bar, the average age was 7, and in the blue bar, the average age was 10. So will he ever be alive again? Most of them seem to understand that death was permanent. The 5-year-olds were the most likely to say yes. But I mean, that's a small percentage of the youngest kids who said the mouse could be alive again. But what do you see with the rest of them? It looks like youngest kids especially think that the mouse is still feeling things that you would feel when you're alive. He's thirsty. He still feels sick. He wants to go home. And then what's interesting is that the middle-aged children that were on average 7 years old, they didn't even respond, does he still love his mother? None of them agreed to that. But the youngest and the oldest did. He still loves his mother after he's dead. So some of these questions illustrate that while they all know that death is permanent, they're not exactly sure what it means. And so that's where adults can really step in to help kids cope with the process of somebody having died or a pet having died, is to help them to recognize that it not only is permanent, but it also means these other things. And this is where social things come in, religious practices, things like that come in to help us have answers for these questions. And when we talk about adolescents and emerging adults coping with death, they really, during this period of time, as we all recall from those stages of life, they're suffering from the invincibility fallacy. So they have very little fear that anything could happen to them at all, let alone death. And actually what we think might be going on with this invincibility fallacy is that it's a type of terror management. Terror management theory says that being aware of our own mortality causes us to be anxious. It triggers existential anxiety in us. And so a lot of times to cope with that existential anxiety, or to avoid it really, to take a different path, we accept a worldview that's provided by our culture. So like, young people never die, I'll be fine. Or my religion says that if I die, I will go to heaven, or wherever my religion says happens next. Those things might help us to cope with the fear that we're all sort of carrying in the back of our minds about death. And for teens and emerging adults, they may project this image of invincibility when in fact they're feeling a little bit of terror and they're trying to mask it. Something that's really kind of indicative that they might be experiencing terror management is that adolescents will simultaneously deny that anything bad could happen to them, but they sort of kind of imagine that they'll die young anyway, and what's the difference? A lot of times teenagers will say things like, die young and leave a good-looking corpse. I mean, these kinds of sort of dark humor to show that I'm not scared of it, it's going to happen anyway, but the truth is they aren't really completely accepting the fact that something could happen to them. So we see them doing things that really could cause something to happen to them. We talked about this before in another chapter, but so we see a lot of modes of death for young people that are completely avoidable. They're not dying on average of things that are contagious or something like that. They're dying of things that they've chosen to do. Now here's something that's really interesting. If you compare 15 to 24-year-olds early in the 20th century and what was killing them in 1907, you see a teeny tiny slice of homicide, suicide, and then accidents, and the vast majority were dying of diseases. Today that's really changed. It's really flipped. So where we're seeing, mostly accidents, and then, unacceptably high levels of suicide and homicide, and then thankfully a reduction in the disease loss, right? Because we've got vaccines and better treatments and things like that. So right now, 15 to 24-year-olds, adolescents and emerging adults are too often doing things that could lead to their own death, in part because they're denying the risk. So here, let's talk about adults between the ages of 25 and 65 and see there's kind of a flow here. Accepting your own mortality during this age bracket may trigger less risk-taking. So once a person, a lot of times it's when they become a parent, they suddenly start to become aware that something bad could happen to them, and they don't want something bad to happen to them. And so they reduce their risk-taking. The reduction in risk-taking is a clear attempt to reduce the likelihood of death, to avoid or postpone, right? Death anxiety, this terror management kind of approach, seems to decrease after emerging adulthood and gets replaced with a lot more concrete, sort of, for lack of a better word, mature way of realizing that death can happen to anyone, and so let's take proper steps to try and protect ourselves as well as we can. Now, what about a terminally ill person during this age bracket? People who have been told that they have an incurable illness or disease tend to report worrying about leaving things undone. Pablo Picasso said, "Only put off until tomorrow what you are willing to die having left undone." A lot of people are, when they think about their own mortality, they think about all the things that they haven't done yet, or that they would miss out on, or those kinds of things. And then leaving their family. Leaving people who are responsible, that they are responsible for, leaving people who are your dependents. That's a scary thought. Leaving your spouse without you and the support that you've provided and things like that. Those things are things that we worry about when facing death. So the terminally ill tend to have this sort of fear of what would their absence do to other people. Now, over the age of 65, what we see is a really strong reduction in death anxiety. So in the adolescent, emerging adulthood period, we have terror management going on, where we're in denial about death. During adulthood, we almost become like overly cautious because we're afraid that we might be doing something that could lead to our untimely death or could contribute to it. Over age 65, people start to return back to that sort of they kind of look like adolescents in the way that they say, well, what can I do anyway? You do the best you can, or those kinds of phrases, without the denial part. Like really, they're starting to look at their lives and saying, well, I've had a long life, and so I'm not necessarily anxious about death. And there's an increase during this period of time in rates of hope. The idea that I'm going to live my life to the fullest. I'm going to enjoy all the time I have, things like that. So what we think is that people who show signs of accepting their own mortality, and that can be defined by doing any one or combination of the things here, writing a will, designating healthcare proxies, reconciling with estranged family members, realizing that time might be short, planning your own funeral. These are all signs that the person has accepted their own mortality. Those things have been associated with better mental health, less depression, less anxiety. So among people who are over age 65 who have done these things, they tend to be experiencing more satisfying lives and fewer negative symptoms. All right, I'm going to finish this little section by talking about something that might seem a little out of place, near-death experience, but sometimes we have accidents that cause us to have a period of time where basically you're clinically dead, but then they're able to resuscitate you. Certain illnesses can have that effect, or sometimes it happens in a person who thinks that they were close to death, and they might have a near-death experience. The basic idea is a person comes close to dying, but then survives. And people who have had these experiences tend to report very consistent things. A sensation that they left their body, that they maybe even saw their body from a third person perspective. They may report that they saw a really, really bright white light, and the light was the brightest light they'd ever seen, but it didn't hurt their eyes. Feeling peacefulness and joy. So when they saw the light, it felt like a warm, friendly light, not as something scary. Some people will report religious elements. Even people who are not believers will oftentimes report religious elements. Even people who don't believe in heaven will oftentimes report some of these symptoms. So why? Why do people have these very similar experiences when they are near death or think they're near death? Well, if you're a dualist, which is a type of philosopher, you would believe that your mind and your body are separate. And so, those two things sort of exist in parallel, your mind being one thing that's independent of the body that it carries around. So for a dualist, a near-death experience proves that there's a heaven, that when you die, when your body dies, your mind or your soul goes on to heaven. Monists are philosophers who believe that the mind and the body are one, and that the brain is where your mind comes from, and really your mind is just reflecting the functioning of your brain. So for a monist, a near-death experience occurs because as your brain shuts down, you might start to feel, thanks to endorphins, like you're floating, or that everything's peaceful and that you feel actually a positive mood. As your brain starts to shut down different regions, the last part to shut down might be the occipital lobe where vision occurs. And so all of the brain activity is shutting down, and the last thing that you're consciously aware of is that that bright light feeling that's actually emanating from the cells of your brain firing, the back part of your brain. And then the religious elements is, in this theory, going to be attributable to sort of social or societal expectations. Of course, we don't know which one is true, but I can tell you a couple of things about monism. One is that when people pass out, they oftentimes report these exact same symptoms. If you've ever passed out, you may have felt like there was a bright light right before everything went black. When people pass out and then they come back awake, they oftentimes are laughing when they wake up. They're kind of giddy. And they say, why'd you wake me up from this great dream I was having? And they may say that they felt like they were floating. So it could just be literally that, sort of as blood flow leaves the brain, these are the symptoms that we have. The other thing that supports a monist interpretation is the fact that some people who have used LSD or other kind of psychedelic kinds of drugs report very similar symptoms. Floating and joy, peaceful, maybe not a pinprick of light that's bright, but instead maybe they're seeing light trailing after their hands. Things like that. So some people say, it's just your brain shutting down. It's just your brain. Other people say, no, it's your soul leaving your body. Guess we won't ever really know the answer to that until we ultimately die. So just an interesting thing I thought I'd throw in there. Okay, so let's stop here. We'll come back and we'll talk about dying and acceptance of dying in our next segment.